Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI as we say. My name is Fred Kuntz, and I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs at CIGI. This evening is the final signature lecture of the 2011-12 season, and I'd like to thank CIGI's public event sponsors, 570 News and Wordsworth Books, for their ongoing support in making this series a success. I'd like to thank all of you for braving the elements tonight and being here. Besides the audience here tonight, we also have a global audience watching on the live webcast. And following tonight's address, we welcome questions from the audience, either at the microphones here at CIGI, or else if you're watching online, you can ask questions through the live chat function on your screen, and we'll transmit those questions to our panel. For those using Twitter during tonight's event, we encourage you to use the hashtag CIGILive to join in the online conversation. Our topic tonight, Unleashing the Nuclear Watchdog, Strengthening and Reform of the IAEA, shares the title of a major report released last week by CIGI and the Canadian Centre for Treaty Compliance. The IAEA is, of course, the International Atomic Energy Agency. This is a multilateral global governance mechanism that many of us may have heard mentioned in the news about Fukushima's disaster or the concerns about Iran's nuclear weapons program. This agency is 55 years old, and the question was asked, is it doing its job well? What role should it have, and how can it do its job better? We have two people with us tonight who are well suited to discuss this issue. Tonight's discussant is CIGI Chair of Global Security and Director of the Balsley School of International Affairs, David Welch, who will be up here shortly to introduce our keynote speaker, CIGI Senior Fellow Trevor Findlay. An expert in international relations and security, as well as foreign policy decision-making, David Welch is the author of numerous award-winning books, including his 2005 book, Painful Choices, A Theory of Foreign Policy Change. As I mentioned, he's the director of the Balsley School of International Affairs and also the host of CIGI's video podcast series, Inside the Issues. So please join me in welcoming David Welch.
Thank you, Fred. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, and welcome to the audience. It's an additional pleasure for me to introduce our guest tonight, Trevor Findlay, who's probably, I think, without any doubt, the world's foremost expert on the International Atomic Energy Agency, about which he will be speaking tonight on the basis of his recent very thoughtful and thorough report. Trevor Findlay is professor at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University in Ottawa, where he holds the William and Jeannie Barton Chair in International Affairs. He's also the director of the Canadian Centre for Treaty Compliance at the Norman Paterson School, and he's also a fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University this year, where he did a good deal of the work preparing this report. And he has a degree from the University of Melbourne, as well as Master's and PhD in International Relations from the Australian National University in Canberra. Trevor Findlay spent 13 years as an Australian Foreign Service officer with postings in Tokyo, Mexico City, and Geneva, served as an Australian delegate to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, the UN General Assembly, and UN Disarmament Commission in New York. He started his academic career at the Australian National University as Foreign Affairs Fellow, Senior Fellow, and Acting Head of the Peace Research Center. Subsequently, he was inaugural project leader on peacekeeping and regional security at SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and then spent 7 years as executive director of the Verification, Research, Training, and Information Center, VERTIC, in London. He chaired the Independent Commission on the Verifiability of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 2002, and was advisor also to the Canadian chair of the UN Expert Panel on Verification in 2006. Professor Findlay has been a senior fellow at CIGI for 6 years and has managed two major projects for CIGI on global nuclear governance, both in cooperation with the CCIC. The first, from 2006 to 2010, was a multidisciplinary project called Nuclear Energy Futures, Implications and Options for Global Governance. The project produced a 4-volume report by Professor Findlay covering the future of nuclear energy to 2030 and the implications for nuclear safety, nuclear security, and nuclear nonproliferation, respectively, as well as an overview and an action plan. The current report on strengthening and reform of the IAEA is a follow-on study to that initial one. Professor Findlay's previous work on global governance includes reports on enhancing the organization for the prohibition of chemical weapons and on lessons to be learned from the UN peace operations in Cambodia and Somalia, and from the UN Special Commission and the UN Monitoring, Verification, and Inspection Commission in Iraq. Professor Findlay is currently, as I said, visiting research fellow with the International Security Program and the Project on Managing the Atom at the Belfer Center at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. It's my very great pleasure and privilege to welcome Professor Findlay to the stage this evening. Trevor.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you all for coming out on this rather rainy evening. And it's great to be home in Waterloo. I feel even more at home this evening because yesterday as I came through Toronto Airport, I was granted landed immigrant status in Canada. So I feel more Canadian, thank you, than I ever have before. It's been a great pleasure to do this project with CIGI. They've got an absolutely wonderful team. And I just want to thank a couple of people. I know one shouldn't single out people, but they've been so terrific. I'd like to thank them straight away. Fred Kunz, who managed the media and outreach program for the report, and Blaney, who got me from point A to point B in my various travels. Carol Bonnet, a terrific editor. She's done a wonderful job on the report. And Kevin Diaz, my new right-hand man, who's kept me out of trouble in my various travels. So thank you all. I think you'll agree from just the design of the cover that, as they say in Hollywood, CIGI has very high production values. It's extremely well designed, and I think you'll agree the graphic is a very stunning one, although some Harvard wit had the temerity to say it looked like the IAEA had escaped. But I'm assured by Fred that well-trained dogs, when they're let off the leash, are actually at their best. So I was reassured about the metaphor. So this is what I want to do tonight, is to really just give you a quick run through the report. It's quite long, but pick out the most salient points that I hope you'll be interested in. So I'll describe briefly the project and then the report, which is the product of that project. I want to talk about the IAEA in general, for those who aren't familiar with this organization, the current status of the agency, in my view, the future challenges, and then I'll go through the programs one by one and point out not only their current status, but where I think they might be improved, and then the operations. And the operations include matters like finance and management, and I know that sounds rather dull, but actually all are critical to the running of the agency. And finally, I'll draw some conclusions for you. So the project and the report, it's a joint undertaking of my very small research unit at Carleton University called the Canadian Centre for Treaty Compliance, and CIGI, of course, and it's been a very good partnership. It's run for over 2.5 years now, so in that respect it's been rather time-consuming. It's an outgrowth of my previous project for CIGI on the future of nuclear energy. And while I was doing that report, it occurred to me, if it hadn't been clear before, that the International Atomic Energy Agency touches on almost every part of the global governance scheme. And so in a sense, it's the nucleus around which everything revolves in nuclear governance. So I thought, well, it would be a good idea to draw all of those implications from that study and add new ones and take a holistic look at the agency. One of the criticisms of the agency is often that its operations are very stovepiped into different departments. So you have safety, security, safeguards, peaceful uses. And the ironic thing, or maybe it's natural, is that outside observers also stovepipe themselves. So you'll get experts in safeguards, lots and lots of them, who know nothing or care nothing about peaceful uses or security. And my aim was really to take a look over the whole organization and decide what really would be best for the organization as a whole, rather than taking this narrow stovepiping view. The project was based on interviews extensively with people in Vienna at the agency itself, with outside observers, diplomatic missions, academics. We went through extensive documentation, which I can assure you is a nightmare when it comes to the IAEA. Just figuring out their numbering system is quite a work. And we did some original search as well, particularly on the charts that you will see in the report. There are huge amounts of recommendations throughout the report, but towards the end of it you will see 20 groups of recommendations. And the idea here was not necessarily to prioritize them, but really to sheet home responsibility. Many reports on global governance are written in the passive tense. They don't really identify who's responsible for doing what in terms of reform. So to my mind, that was the most important thing I could do, not just to make recommendations, but to say who should be responsible for fixing the problem. So you'll see in the report, I actually say whether it's the member states, whether it's the Director General of the agency, or whether it's the Board of Governors, etc. The IAEA, this is how it describes itself: an independent, intergovernmental, science and technology-based organization in the United Nations system that serves as the global focal point for nuclear cooperation. This is not entirely accurate, unfortunately. It's certainly science and technology-based, but politics play quite a large part in it. It's in the United Nations system, but it's not a United Nations body. That's another quirk. And in some ways, it's not the focal point, which is one of the criticisms I make in my report. It sets itself up as the global focal point, but doesn't always meet those expectations. It's based in Vienna, Austria. It's got 153 member states, and new states are joining all the time. As you see, it's relatively small. It's only got 2,300 employees and a relatively small budget, and that includes some amount for technical cooperation, which is to assist developing countries in the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. It has a general conference. All the member states are members of the general conference. They all get a voting right. Then it has a board of governors, which is 35 members strong, and it's rather more restricted. It has a director general, currently Mr. Yukiya Amano, a Japanese gentleman, and a secretariat, so an international civil service that runs the agency. And that includes an inspectorate that you probably have heard about on the news in Iraq or Iran or elsewhere. So it's not a huge organization, but it is quite a varied one, as you can see. The agency stems from President Eisenhower's speech in 1953 to the United Nations General Assembly, in which he proposed the Atoms for Peace program. And the idea there was that the United States and other capable nuclear countries would provide assistance to the developing countries, in fact all non-nuclear countries, to pursue civilian nuclear energy. So building power plants, using nuclear energy to assist in medicine, agriculture. And it was very much oversold. There was talk that electricity would be too cheap to meter, and there was an expectation that nuclear power plants could be given out freely without much trouble. Well, it turned out not to be like that. Nuclear power plants were much more expensive than expected. Thank you, Anne. Thank you very much. There were safety and security implications, and the biggest concern, of course, was that the same technology that would be used to generate electricity could train nuclear scientists, which could eventually lead to a nuclear weapons program. Material could be diverted to a nuclear weapons program. So suddenly this Atoms for Peace idea didn't look as rosy as it did in the earlier days. So essentially they set up an International Atomic Energy Agency, which would fulfill this bargain in part, but the giveaway, the peaceful uses assistance, would be subject to nuclear safeguards. I'll talk about that a bit later on, but essentially methods to stop states using their peaceful nuclear technology for weapons purposes. The IAEA statute, negotiated in 1956 between interested states, including Canada, embodies this bargain, and it's been problematic ever since. In 1970, we had the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty come into force, and this also changed the International Atomic Energy Agency's role. For the first time, if you were a party to the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, you were obliged legally to put all your peaceful nuclear facilities under these safeguards, subject to inspection. It was now compulsory. There was no way around it if you were a party to the NPT. So that gave, in a way, the agency a very strong legal raison d'etre. But at the same time, it introduced complications because several states at the time were members of the IAEA, but they weren't actually parties to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And that's still the case. So we have India, Israel, and Pakistan who aren't party to the NPT, but they're members of the IAEA. And India is a permanent member of the Board of Governors of the IAEA. So you can see the problems that that might actually bring. Over the years, the agency's acquired other mandates besides the non-proliferation one, and that is nuclear safety. After the Chernobyl accident, it was realized that the agency should have a much stronger role in nuclear safety, that is ensuring nuclear power plants were safe. And after 9/11, it was realized, even though 9/11 was not a nuclear event, that perhaps terrorists were planning a nuclear event and that nuclear materials should be secured so that nuclear terrorism was not possible. So again, the agency took on a role there as well. What is the current state of the agency, in my view? Well, it's now become indispensable. It's clear that no one country or group of countries, however powerful or influential, could do what the agency does, particularly in the area of inspections. This was a revolutionary idea at the time the agency was set up, that actually you would open up your industry, any part of it, to foreign inspectors. So Canada, for instance, all its nuclear activities are subject to inspection by the IAEA, to the extent that the agency has an office in Toronto to handle the volume of inspection that Canada willingly undergoes. Unfortunately, though, the agency has become politicized over the years. There used to be something in the Board of Governors called the Spirit of Vienna, which sounded very romantic on the Danube, the famous Spirit of Vienna, but unfortunately that's dissipated with various political crises. So it's not quite the scientific and technical organization that it describes itself as. Politics has unfortunately injected itself into the governance of the agency, not necessarily the technical secretariat, but the governance of the agency. The agency has, over the years, however, reacted rather well to crises. As I think I indicated, after Chernobyl, it grasped the nuclear safety mandate quite well. After we discovered that Iraq had come rather close to acquiring nuclear weapons, it revolutionized its nuclear safeguards. So that was quite a great way to seize the opportunity of something that actually had been not so well done by the agency. They'd missed the Iraq case, but they moved very quickly to improve their performance thereafter. The agency still is a vital mediator of this bargain that I talked about between peaceful uses and non-proliferation. If the agency didn't exist, it's hard to see who would provide all this cooperation. And some states are very sensitive about receiving it from the United States, for instance. An international body can do what one single state cannot do in terms of cooperation. In generally, the agency I found to be technically competent still. There's some amazing people there with great experience and skills. And it has retained, I believe, its impartiality, at least from the point of view of the International Civil Service. The Board of Governors is quite another thing, but the International Civil Service, I think, has maintained its impartiality. But the Iran case has really tested that. And we can talk about this in question time if you like, but Iran, because it's been accused of non-compliance with its safeguards obligation, has taken to causing mischief throughout the agency in areas which really you wouldn't expect these issues to be raised. So that is problematic. And as I'll illustrate too, the agency is under-resourced for all the tasks it's supposed to take on a technical basis. So there's some challenges there. The agency has a unique role in fostering an international nuclear community, and I hadn't quite realized this till I did my study, but it regards all the people who work in it and all the people who train under it as graduates of the IAEA. And this spreads the idea of peaceful uses and the norms that should go with that, like be safe, keep your nuclear material secure, to countries around the world. So it's passed through a lot of employees who have now gone on to their national nuclear authorities and hopefully embody the norms that the agency is propagating. But the IAEA could do a lot more. It is surprisingly remote from the industry that it's supposed to govern. It is an organization of member states. States run it, are most active in its activities. It is relatively remote from the nuclear industry, which seems bizarre, but the nuclear industry regards international bodies as essentially interfering and too much trouble, and dealing with issues that the nuclear industry really would rather not concern itself with, such as nuclear weapons, for instance. So there's a strange disconnect there. The agency is, however, relatively lean and mean. It's been subjected for about 20 years to zero real growth, so its budget has not ballooned. That's forced it to be relatively effective and efficient. But my study revealed that actually it could do with more resources in almost every single program. I came to this very skeptical. Why should we throw more money at an international organization? And there were some who said, well, let's double the budget. But my view was, okay, I should be skeptical about every single program, see whether these programs deserve more funding, and I found actually that they could do a lot more with more funding in almost every single area. Future challenges. One of the challenges of a verification organization like the IAEA, if you think about it, is it has to last forever. If we're serious, for instance, about nuclear disarmament, then that's a forever project. So this organization will be with us in perpetuity, and it really needs to think about how it does that, how it doesn't atrophy or become lazy because there are no non-compliance cases. This is a real challenge. One of the problems of the non-proliferation regime is that states can build up the capability for a nuclear weapons program while remaining completely legal. Under the NPT, you're allowed to have the whole range of peaceful nuclear facilities in the nuclear fuel cycle, as long as you declare them. And as we found in the case of Iran, some countries are willing to build facilities in secret and not declare them. This is a huge challenge for the agency. How do you find undeclared nuclear facilities? Under the treaty, you're supposed to declare everything you have. It's subjected to inspections and nuclear counting. If you don't declare it, the agency has huge difficulties finding what's there. So that's going to be a continuing challenge because countries, if they're inclined to violate their obligations, will go to great lengths to hide what they have. Iran, for instance, has put its latest enrichment facility underground, and it wasn't discovered till an opposition group let the IAEA know about it. So this is really quite a challenge for the agency. In the area of nuclear safety and security, these will go forever. These are works in progress that never end. If you ask an engineer whether this nuclear power plant is safe, he'll say, well, as safe as we can make it, but he'll never say it's completely safe. So that applies also to the security area. The agency also may be faced with new special verification mandates. As you probably know, occasionally we get a non-compliant case come up. Syria was an example. Iran, Iraq, of course, North Korea. And then the agency has to scramble to do these special verification activities, which are very intensive. Iran is now one of the most inspected countries in the world, and all this has to be added to the agency's usual activities. Nuclear disarmament. There is an idea that as the world goes towards zero nuclear weapons, if and when it does, the agency would have a role in verifying this. So verifying that materials withdrawn from nuclear weapons weren't then reused for nuclear weapons and were diverted to peaceful purposes. This will be an enormous task, particularly because some of the fissile material in weapons is classified. So the last thing you need is for the IAEA to come in possession of classified information about nuclear material. At the moment, they deal only with peaceful uses, and that's really the way we need to keep it. So that is an enormous challenge. And then the nuclear revival. As you know, and my previous report looked at this, there's great talk of a nuclear energy renaissance. That is more and more countries turning to nuclear energy to solve their electricity shortages, but also to meet the demands of climate change, because nuclear energy is relatively carbon-free, relatively green. Since Fukushima, a number of countries have decided to give up their ambitions to acquire nuclear energy, or in the case of Germany, to wind down their current involvement. But nonetheless, it occurs to me that if we do have catastrophic climate change and states scramble to meet their energy needs and meet their carbon emissions targets, then there could be a crash program of nuclear energy. So the IAEA needs to be ready for that. Let me move on to the various programs. Nuclear safeguards. Nuclear safeguards are supposed to detect any diversion by states of nuclear material from peaceful purposes to weapons purposes. That's what nuclear safeguards do. And they do this through inspections, through remote monitoring increasingly. They have 24-hour video to Vienna from various locations in countries, and nuclear accounting, where inspectors go in and look at the books to make sure that they add up. As I said, it's mandatory under the NPT, so every NPT member state has to have inspections. So the growth in safeguards has been enormous as more and more countries join the NPT. They've vastly improved since the Iraq case, since we discovered Iraq had almost developed nuclear weapons. They detected the North Korean program, so that was a plus for the agency. They actually were able to use nuclear accounting and inspectors to discover that North Korea had not declared everything it should have and was on the way to making nuclear weapons. But it missed Iran and it missed Syria, so clearly we're not there yet in terms of the capacity of safeguards. And continuing strengthening is needed. And there are various elements of this strengthening listed there, which I discuss more in my report. One approach is risk management. Up to now, the IAEA has just looked at the agreements, decided whether it could verify compliance with those agreements, but really didn't look beyond them. Now, it actually has a strategic plan. It's looking at risk assessment and asking itself, what possible future cases could there be out there? And how do we detect those, and how would we react if a future non-compliance case is discovered? What is the risk of that? What is the financial risk to the agency that might have an impact on safeguards? To me, this is exactly what they should be doing, but it's quite revolutionary in terms of the IAEA's previous work. So they're becoming more forward-looking, which is terrific. You probably noticed there a reference to cultural change. You might think that's a bit odd. But in fact, one of the problems of the old safeguard system before Iraq was that safeguards more or less did a tick box exercise. They had a list of issues that they had to look at and make sure everything was fine, and then they would tick the box, they would send the report back to Vienna, and the report would be filed. Now, the culture of inspections and inspectors is being changed, so inspectors are meant to be more inquisitive. They're supposed to come to a nuclear site. If they don't see anything that's quite right, they're now encouraged to ask questions of the host country or the company running the nuclear facility, report back to Vienna, and then if there is some discrepancy in their reporting, that is then fed into the future inspections. Whereas previously, it was pretty much an accounting exercise. So there's a whole mindset needs to change with the inspectors, many of whom are getting on. They've been with the agency for a long time. The new inspectors have to be trained to think in this more inquisitive way. And hopefully that will pay off. Trained inspectors should be able to see anomalies and then ask relevant questions about them. One of the other items there is weaponization. And it suddenly dawned on the agency that not only should they be worrying about whether materials are diverted from peaceful uses to weapons purposes, they also should be on the lookout for whether there are activities to make nuclear weapons. You would think this would be a very obvious and logical thing to do, but the agency's never seen that role for itself. And in the case of Iran, if you follow the Iran issue, the agency is now looking at the so-called weaponization issues. Is Iran actually preparing to use material for a weapon? Is it carrying out tests that would help it design a nuclear warhead, for instance? All this is relatively new. So in the safeguards area, I simply encourage the agency to get on with it. They're actually doing a pretty good job of forward-looking thinking and strategic planning. On the nuclear safety area, things aren't quite so rosy. As you know, there was quite a disaster in Fukushima. The Japanese had, over the years, been told they needed to fix the relationship between their regulator and their industry. And this had come up in IAEA-sponsored conferences where countries' nuclear safety records are reviewed periodically. The Japanese ignored that. And the problem in the nuclear safety area, illustrated by this, is that the agency doesn't have mandatory powers. It has mandatory powers in the safeguards area, stopping countries moving towards nuclear weapons, but in the safety area, where the aim is to prevent accidents, the agency can only recommend measures. Its guidelines, its Documents are purely recommendatory. No state is obliged to have them. It organises peer reviews of safety for nuclear power installations. Again, the recommendations are only mandatory. So this is a huge problem for global governance. You would think that after Fukushima there would have been a move to change this, and indeed there was. But unfortunately, I think that Mr. Amano was relatively weakened politically and wasn't able to devote the necessary political energy to reforming this system. It turned out in any event that some key countries were against having mandatory regulations and mandatory inspections, and one of those was the United States. The Russians, amazingly enough, were in favour of this. So unfortunately, you had a division amongst key countries at the agency about whether this system could now be made mandatory. Luckily, we do have another organisation of nuclear operators which does its own peer reviews. So you have two systems. You have the IAEAs and you have WANOs, the World Association of Nuclear Operators. But up till now, they haven't really talked to each other. They haven't exchanged information. So there's been something of a turnaround here. So that's relatively good news. These two organisations will now exchange lessons learned. They'll talk to each other about how they conduct their peer reviews. But to my mind, really, the agency needs to improve its record on this and create a truly global nuclear network. At the moment, the industry, as I said, is relatively removed from the agency, which is very surprising. So really, they should get closer to the industry and the regulators if they're going to create a true global network. There also needs to be a strengthening of the IAEA emergency response capabilities. In the event of an accident, the agency is supposed to be the hub of information. In the case of Fukushima, for 24 hours, the agency said absolutely nothing. And this was problematic because, as you recall, the Japanese government wasn't saying much either. And all the information the agency eventually started to use came from Japan. This is not really what we expect of a body that calls itself the hub of global nuclear governance. Everyone was surprised at the silence, nothing out of Vienna. So the agency really needs to realise, and I think they have in retrospect, that people now look to it partly because of its self-promotion, partly because of the speed of information these days. Everyone wants to know straight away what's happened, and they want the IAEA's opinion on what's happened. The US ambassador at one meeting was so frustrated, he got up and said, look, this is all very well, this information from Japan, which is only partial and we can't necessarily trust it. What the average person wants to know is it safe to eat this lettuce leaf that comes from Japan? That was a pretty stark criticism of the IAEA. So the agency really needs to ramp up its performance here. It has something called a nuclear scale in which it rates the severity of nuclear accidents. And it turns out that scale actually doesn't belong to the agency. It doesn't do the rating itself. So Japan rated its own nuclear accident, which if you think about it is rather strange. You would expect a scale to be used by an independent body, not the country suffering the accident. Naturally, they're going to downplay the severity of what's happened. In case of nuclear security, which, unlike safety, is directed at preventing nuclear terrorism, so it's stopping unauthorized access to nuclear materials, whereas nuclear safety is stopping the materials getting out and harming the environment and human beings. Again, there's a problem here because unlike safeguards, but like safety, IAEA standards are not mandatory and peer reviews are not mandatory. So you can see that member states have not quite trusted the agency, not quite been willing to give up their sovereign rights in this area, not been willing to hand over powers that you would think in principle the agency should have. So the recommendation here is to strengthen the Office of Nuclear Security, which is relatively new, and to try and embed these standards and peer reviews into international thinking. And that can be done. If countries like Canada, which are well disposed toward the agency, start accepting peer reviews, even though Canada probably doesn't need them, and it starts implementing IAEA recommendations, then that all begins to set a good example. That's the one way you embed these ideas into the international community. That's a long haul, but it's probably one of the few ways that you'll get this to happen. There's also an institute in this area too, which is quite apart from the agency, called the World Institute of Nuclear Security in Vienna, relatively new. But it is also comprised of industry and others. Even I've joined. So individuals can join this organization if they have something to contribute in the area of nuclear security. And that's actually good because it gives the agency a bit of competition in this field, and I think there's nothing like that. But one thing I have identified here is a huge opportunity for the agency. As I mentioned, in the past they've been quite good at seizing opportunities as they arise, and often in international affairs there's a window. You just need to leap very quickly to seize an issue, to strengthen your organization before the window shuts again. And there's one coming up that the agency should seize. As you probably know, there have been a series of nuclear summits organized by the United States, the first in Washington, the second just recently in Seoul, South Korea, and the third will be in the Netherlands in 2 years' time. Then the summits will end. At the moment, there's no organization except the United States and its allies which organize these summits. So the question is, who will worry about this issue when the summits end? Who will follow countries' progress improving their nuclear safety? So the agency really needs to seize this. And unfortunately, Mr. Romano had an opportunity at Seoul to announce that the agency would do this, and he didn't. Several months later, he said, well, the IAEA itself would organize a nuclear security conference involving all countries in the international system. And there's a great selling point here because the nuclear security summits have been attended by a hand-picked group of countries. The Americans and their allies essentially chose who would attend. And of course, the developing countries don't like this. They say all countries should be involved in this. And the IAEA, as an almost universal multilateral body, has the chance to do that. So I press on the agency, they really need to grab this opportunity before it disappears. Technical cooperation. As I mentioned, this is designed to assist the developing countries with their development needs in the area of nuclear energy. So it could be building nuclear power plants, although usually it's not as grand as that. It's using nuclear techniques in medicine, agriculture. The tsetse fly, for instance, you can use nuclear medicine to defeat the scourge of tsetse fly. That's just one example. So it has quite a large program. Over the years, however, it's become owned by the developing countries. They've started to argue that it's their right to have this technical cooperation, when in fact, it's a purely voluntary program, this part of the agency's activities. It's essentially the wealthier countries providing money, and the developing countries are the recipient. So it's in essence an aid program. Even though it's called cooperation, it's essentially aid. And as a result of this ownership by the developing countries, the richer states have been very reluctant to force it to reform. So it's not very transparent, it's not very efficient or accountable, and it's certainly not well integrated into developing countries' national development programs. So in some ways, it's the Cinderella area of the IAEA's work, and political pressures have prevented it being reformed. There's a new Ghanaian head of this program who's working now to reform it, so that's terrific. But my own view is that this program should be devoted only to the least developed countries, the very poorest. At the moment, we have countries like Israel, Pakistan, even Singapore receiving aid under this program, which seems nonsensical, particularly when Singapore has a higher GDP per capita than New Zealand. So these richer developing countries, or those already with nuclear capability, should be weaned off this, and it should be devoted entirely to the least developed countries. And there is a defined list by the UN of these countries. It should also be devoted more to safety, security, and non-proliferation, so that assistance given to developing countries doesn't end up causing difficulties in any of those areas. We don't want misuse of this aid program. And also, as the auditor of the IAEA recommends, it should really, at least in this department, consider itself an aid organization and integrate itself into the global development community. There's Mr. Romano there. He's the current Director General of the IAEA. There is talk in the rounds in Vienna that the IAEA management is now becoming over-centralized. And part of the problem here is that when it was set up 50 years ago, it was felt sufficient to have a Director General and then a whole string of departments underneath him and nothing in between. So my proposal here is to have a real Deputy Director General, which is what most organizations do, someone who can take over the reins as necessary, relieve the burden of particularly political crises that the IAEA seems to face every now and to help avoid that over-centralization that now seems to be occurring in the IAEA. You'd also be stunned to know the IAEA, after 50 years, does not have a strategic plan. The Safeguards Department does, the agency itself doesn't. So in a sense, there is no list of priorities for the agency to pursue. The budget is not guided by any strategic plan. They get a certain amount of money and they simply divide it up, usually in the way they've always divided it up. So that's extremely surprising. So that's one recommendation in my report. I'm not a management consultant, but clearly the agency is not perfect in its management practices, and particularly personnel practices. So my recommendation is they get a good management study done. And hopefully that will lead to modern practices. On the budget, you might think this is very dull stuff, but the budget, as you probably know, many organisations reflects the priorities that the organisation has, and decisions about budget can affect things on the ground. As I mentioned, the agency has been subjected to zero real growth for almost 20 years. That's a very long time. And it's a very blunt way of shaping an agency's budget, just to lop percentages off every year and compensate for inflation, but really not go any further. So one of my proposals is to end this zero growth budget idea with a needs-based approach. So try and determine exactly what the agency needs in all its programs, as I did more or less, and then compound these. To my mind, that's a much better approach. You'll probably be dismayed to learn that Canada is leading the charge on keeping the IAEA budget at zero real growth. They are a member of the so-called Geneva group of Western countries, which pursue this policy across all UN agencies. To my mind, that is rather self-defeating, at least in the case of this agency. So to treat UNESCO and UNCTAD and the IAEA as all the same seems to me rather foolish and self-defeating, particularly seeing this organisation is so important to international security. I also argue in the report that the newly emerging countries, the countries which now boast about their improved economic status, who claim that they're overtaking the Western countries in terms of their economic prowess, should, in return, be asked to contribute more to organisations like the IAEA. At the moment, all of the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, have had a discount on their contribution to the agency in financial terms, and some have received technical cooperation, so they've actually been a net benefiter from the agency's activities. So if these countries really want to play a bigger role in the international system, if they claim to be developing fast and have more income at their disposal, they should be asked to contribute more. So in my report, I suggest ways in which this could be rebalanced so that there's a fairer share of the budget given to the agency. You'll see contingency fund there. You probably wonder why that's there. Actually, the IAEA at the moment gives countries refunds. So if they have a surplus at the end of the year, they actually send money back to the countries that have given the money on a proportional basis. And as I've argued, I don't really think the Canadian Treasury is sitting there thinking, well, we can't wait to get our hands on that refund from the IAEA. It seems a crazy system. So that really should go into contingency fund. So the agency shouldn't be in the business of refunding when its financial needs are so great. It has at last acquired, the agency, a major capital investment fund because as a result of zero real growth, its facilities, its technologies, its personnel had been in decline for many years. I actually visited the agency's laboratory outside Vienna, incredibly decrepit facility, not state-of-the-art equipment, and you'll be alarmed to learn that the facility didn't comply with the agency's own recommendations on safety and security that it would be claiming should be carried out by member states. There wasn't even a guard in sight. There was no security wall. You could just walk straight in. They'd actually had an accident there several weeks earlier involving a plutonium sample, which is not really very encouraging. So they've now put money into this facility. They're actually starting to improve the position, but clearly we can't have an agency that's so important in such a decrepit state. Finally, I've suggested they think about a resource mobilization strategy. That's a very fancy way of saying they need a plan to get more money. And one way they could do that would be to set up some sort of endowment. it occurs to me there'd be rich individuals or organisations out there who, once they knew the importance of the agency's work, would be willing to put money into the agency. But probably at the moment, the Bill Gates of this world and others don't have an idea how they could help. To have a contingency fund would, seems to me, go a long way to doing that. My conclusion, as you may have guessed, about the agency is that it can do certain things itself. That is in terms of the technical secretariat. It could have better management, better planning, better personnel policies. But it needs more authority, more resources, more political support from the member states. They are absolutely critical. This is not a revolutionary conclusion, but it turns out that in every area that you could examine, the problem is ultimately the member states. They don't give the agency enough authority in a particular area. They are reluctant to accept the agency's recommendations and peer reviews. They quibble over the budget to the extent of harming programs. They have politicised the governance of the agency to the point where very sensible reforms cannot get through. Just to give you one example of that, the Board of Governors at one stage set up a verification committee to improve safeguards. The Secretariat presented a whole list of very sensible ideas for improvement, and the committee fell apart because Iran and the United States spent the whole time arguing about the Iran case. So nothing could be done in this committee, and it was abolished after a couple of years. It simply did nothing. So unfortunately, politics has infused the governance of the agency, and that really needs to be turned around. It's very difficult to imagine how you can remove politics from an agency like this. So the Board of Governors is the place where politics is meant to be ironed out, where countries can put their case and defend themselves. But it's reached the point where this has simply gone too far, and it's infected areas which really should not be politicised. How to fix this? The agency is subject to the wider international security system. There are lots of political pressures on the agency that are completely beyond its ability to control or affect. Some reforms may help a biannual general conference instead of an annual conference. The annual conference is so politicised, and there are repeated resolutions on the same subjects every year. So rather than having a fight every year, my suggestion is they have a fight every 2 years, and maybe that will relieve some of the political pressures on the agency. Currently, the Board of Governors is run by a hand-picked group of countries who re-elect themselves every year. Canada is one of these, I have to say. These are the original founding members of the agency who've so rigged the electoral system that they can essentially self-nominate, and each year they are seated back on the board on the basis of their prowess in nuclear technology. And my argument is that over time, this state of affairs changes. So the Board of Governors should reflect changing power in the international system. Otherwise, states become very dissatisfied. So, for instance, Germany is getting out of the nuclear power business, so it no longer should be guaranteed a seat on the Board of Governors. Other countries are becoming more interested in nuclear energy. South Korea is a major nuclear energy generator, so it should have a chance for more representation on the Board of Governors. That may not solve the political problems entirely, but would relieve frustration on the part of countries who feel they're locked out of the board system because of a past decision about who was the most important in this field. But I think one of the huge blockages to strengthening and reform of the agency is this bargain that I talked about. There is dissatisfaction with the bargain after all these years, and it really focuses on the question of the commitment that many states made to give up their nuclear weapon option in return for peaceful assistance, but also in return for nuclear disarmament by the countries that already have nuclear weapons. And this nuclear disarmament issue infects a lot of the debates in the IAEA, and unfortunately the agency can't do much about it. The agency is only charged with verifying compliance with one part of the NPT, and that is the peaceful uses part. It has no role in nuclear disarmament whatsoever. So unfortunately, it's beholden to the nuclear weapon states voluntarily fulfilling their obligations under the NPT, which is to gradually move towards nuclear disarmament. And the developing countries and many of the other non-nuclear weapon states say not enough has been done, not enough has been done fast enough, And until we see that, we're not going to be willing to accept more strictures from the IAEA in safety or security. Many developing countries say, well, nuclear security, what's that to us? We're not threatened by nuclear terrorism. It just means more regulations, more obligations on our part. And in the meantime, the nuclear weapons states get off scot-free in terms of their nuclear weapon activity. And you can see there's a compelling argument to be made there. So unfortunately, the IAEA is held hostage to this debate and can do very little to affect it. So my conclusion really after this long study is that the agency ultimately depends on its member states if we are to see a strengthening reform and, in effect, an unleashing of the nuclear watchdog. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Trevor. Am I on? Is the mic on? Good. Thank you very much for that tour de force. It's a very thorough report, and obviously you've done a great deal of integrating an enormous body of material. My job at the moment is briefly to toss batting practice, ask Trevor some questions, to give you all an opportunity to think about what you would like to pursue with him further, and before long we will turn to audience questions and also questions from the web audience. Let me begin by asking, what was the condition of the morale in Vienna? You spent a lot of time with people in the IAEA. How do they feel about their own work? Is it a positive attitude? Do they feel proud of what they do, or is there a sense of frustration and concern for the future?
I think they are proud of what they do. In some ways, it remains a technical agency, so all that technical work continues, and it's a pretty high standard, and I think they are proud of their work. But they are rather frustrated, I think you hit on the right word there, because of the lack of commitment by states and the lack of resources that they're given. I mean, they often make very clear to states that they cannot do a certain activity unless they're given more funding and support. Then when something goes wrong, they get blamed for that. A good example was the communication system between states and the agency in the event of a nuclear disaster. And states are supposed to have a point of contact that the agency can reach in the case of some emergency, like Fukushima. Well, they did a test of this system before Fukushima, and there was some very low rate of response to the so-called contact point. Sometimes the contact point just didn't exist. Sometimes the fax machine didn't work at the other end. Sometimes they got someone who knew nothing about the IAEA or its nuclear activities. And the agency had warned countries about this poor system before Fukushima, and absolutely nothing was done because it was probably too much trouble. So there is frustration, and many of them are very dedicated. They really want to do a much better job than they are currently doing.
Do they feel they're not doing a very high-level job?
I think they feel they're doing the best that they can in the circumstances. Yes.
And what's been the reaction to your report in the IAEA?
I haven't had an overall reaction yet, but of course the report is critical of some areas. It's supportive overall of the agency. I think the winners like it very much. The losers don't like it so much. There are some who would lose out in terms of reforms I'm proposing, and others who would gain. So I tend to get reaction from various different parts of the department, of the organisation. Depending on the department, it varies. But many of them are still studying it. We only launched it in Vienna last Wednesday, so it was embargoed until then. So they were presented with my overall conclusions at a presentation like this, but they've only just now had time to digest the report. It has gone to the Director General, so I'm hoping he and his office will look at it carefully.
You mentioned that it's an oddity that the nuclear industry is quite arm's length from the IAEA, and as you were saying that, I was wondering whether that's such a bad thing. Wouldn't it introduce some complications and potential conflicts of interest if there were tight integration between the nuclear industry and the independent watchdog?
Yes, I had a question about that in Vienna actually, because there's this phenomenon called regulatory capture, certainly in national relationships between industry and regulator. Over time you can see a phenomenon where the the regulator is infiltrated by industry because it recruits people who know about the industry and they tend to have worked in the industry. And then regulators go back into the industry and you get too cozy a relationship going on. I decided that that really hadn't happened with the IAEA, and I'm not sure it would happen because the agency really is at arm's length. It works through member states with its industry. So there is a barrier there between the industry and the IAEA. The IAEA certainly also takes a very skeptical view of this nuclear revival, which I think is healthy. One of the phenomena I discovered was that many developing countries who have ambitions to acquire a nuclear reactor or several go to the IAEA for advice, and the IAEA sits them down and gets out this huge book called Milestones on the Way to a Nuclear Power Program, and it has hundreds of recommendations from setting up a good regulator, having a proper legal system, getting your electricity grid in order, an incredible number, and these countries go away totally distressed because they realise it's going to take them a decade to prepare for a nuclear power plant and then a decade to build one. So in a way, the agency plays a terrific role here because it deters those states which aren't ready for a nuclear power program. And the industry increasingly is doing the same. They now have a code of conduct which lays down several requirements for states to have in the areas of security, safety, and non-proliferation before they'll even consider supplying a nuclear power plant. Because industry, the last thing they want is a disaster because that will ruin their market. So they're actually very conscious of it. Maybe not as conscious as they should be at times, but after Fukushima particularly, this concern is growing. So I don't think there's a danger of the agency getting too close to industry. I would argue it would be better if they were closer. Then they could work better with them on shaping regulations and getting these peer reviews going that I talked about.
And is there a country the IAEA can point to and say they did it well? Go study how they set up a civilian nuclear program?
We're sitting in it, Canada. Canada has a very good reputation, not only in safeguards, it's one of the most safeguarded countries in the world, so it sets a very good example, but in the area of safety as well. It gives a huge report to the Nuclear Safety Convention review meetings. It's available on the website, which is very transparent, unlike other countries. So I think Canada does set a good example. Where it doesn't is being rather mean with the money. And I'm not quite sure why Canada insists on being the cheerleader here. And Canada's a wealthy country. It itself could afford to pay more. And it does make voluntary contributions to the agency. But to lead the charge on zero real growth seems a role that Canada doesn't necessarily have to play. I'm not quite sure what drives that, but maybe it's just overall fiscal rectitude for which Canada is known. But that is a bit of a puzzle because it doesn't need to take a high profile on finance as in the way it does.
So we have a good reputation on the governance and regulation side, but we've had trouble actually exporting our technology and promoting it globally. It's been a bit of a tough sell.
It has.
In part because we've had some embarrassments. Are those completely unrelated considerations, or is there some connection between those?
I think they're completely unrelated, yes. I think, well, just to talk about the can-do, the government was too slow in privatising that whole industry. And in the meantime, new entrants had come into the market. The French are very aggressive, the South Koreans are very aggressive. So while Canada was waiting to privatise the can-do business, this market just went straight ahead and orders were being taken, plants are being built, and not a single new can-do is being built. So that was a lost opportunity for Canada, I'm afraid, which is a pity because along with the can-do would go Canada's very strong interest in getting safety, security, and all those other aspects right.
It's a very safe reactor technology.
It is, yeah. There hasn't been really a serious incident with that technology. But unfortunately, Canada hasn't exploited that to the full. Mind you, the new can-do has a bit of a quirk in it. It now requires slightly enriched uranium.
Right.
So that's a proliferation issue. Right. Once you enrich uranium, you're producing the possibility of nuclear weapon material.
You also mentioned the grand bargain a few times. The grand bargain involving nuclear weapon states committing to demilitarizing.
Right.
That's much later than the original foundation of the IAEA. So that grand bargain came along a bit later.
It did.
So to what extent does that complicate the IAEA's work when it's really a feature of the NPT rather than the IAEA itself.
Yes, it came with the NPT rather than the IAEA statute. So this was unusual. You had an organisation that wasn't verifying a treaty to which every member state was a party. So in the case of the Chemical Weapons Convention, every country that's a member of the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons is a party to the Chemical Weapons Convention. They were born together. In this case, you have the organisation first, then you have a treaty which is supposed to be verified by the agency. One of the weirdest anomalies is that India was a founding member of the IAEA, is one of these Board of Governors members which is always re-elected in this rigged electoral system, yet it can sit in judgment on parties who violate the Non-Proliferation Treaty, even though India refuses to become a party to that treaty and has criticised it from the moment it was signed. That is one of the strangest anomalies of all. But more broadly than that, it introduces this disarmament issue into what was previously supposed to be an organisation dealing with peaceful uses. And as I say, the IAEA doesn't verify nuclear disarmament. In fact, that's verified by nobody but the nuclear weapons states. Right. That's a real problem. And people get very confused. They think, well, why doesn't the IAEA do something about nuclear disarmament? It's not in its charter. And when the former Director General, al-Baradei, ventured to promote nuclear disarmament after he won the Nobel Peace Prize, he got into all sorts of trouble because it was seen as exceeding his mandate.
Right. Very good. We're going to take some questions from our audiences here and on the web. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please find one of the microphones, but I will begin with a question from our web audience. A question from Rachel in North Bay, Ontario. What do you see as the IAEA's largest communications challenge as they work to strengthen their governance role?
That's a great question, Rachel, because it's clear during the Fukushima incident, the agency didn't understand it had to communicate with the general public and with the media. So it communicated relatively well with its member states via this communications net I just talked about. But when it came to communicating with the outside world, it failed. It was silent for 24 hours after the accident, as I mentioned. So the greatest challenge is to communicate with people in a way that people will understand who don't have a nuclear background. So it needs to be able to translate technical matters into normal language. It needs to employ social media, which it didn't do a too bad job of in Fukushima once it got going. And it also needs to engage with non-governmental organisations much better than it does. My inquiries at the agency as an academic weren't always very welcome. Different parts of the department are more transparent than others and more willing to communicate with the outside world. So yeah, Rachel, it's really communicating with the outside world. If you go on their website, for instance, a very nice front page website, you go below that any depth and it is extremely difficult to get information out of the agency. So they need to do a much better job of that public diplomacy, as it's called, public interface.
Do they have a dedicated public relations department?
They do indeed. And they had a plan for how they should deal with an emergency. It just wasn't implemented, I'm afraid.
Very good. Let me ask you to identify yourself briefly before you ask your question. Over here first, yes.
Hi, I'm Takin. I'm a student at the University of Waterloo. I have basically two questions, but I suppose they're interrelated to each other. The first being that when I was in Vienna, I had the chance of speaking with a couple of inspectors, and they mentioned the basis of their inspection is correctness and completeness, and how once, and this was with respect to the North Korean issue, and they said that, well, it's correct what they've provided with us, but there was a real doubt about its completeness, and how do you solve that challenge? I was hoping you could address that. And also, my second question is with respect to Iran, and you mentioned the issue being politicized. And I remember about a year ago when new material and new evidence was presented, it was also argued that these were evidence that had already been presented 5, 6, 10 years ago, but had been dismissed because of their murky background, essentially. And the reason they were accepted was because of the politicized nature. I was wondering if you could also address that and how how they could go about resolving the real politicization issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great questions. The first one about North Korea is a bit technical, and you're absolutely right. North Korea, when it first had its safeguards agreement, is supposed to declare everything it has, all its nuclear material, its nuclear facilities, and when it did so, it looked like it was correct. From what the agency could tell, the information was correct. It made a certain sense. But when they actually went and inspected North Korea and looked at what the nuclear reactor could produce in terms of weapons material, and they figured out how many days it had been operating, they realized that the declaration by the North Koreans was incomplete. So these are the two aspects they always look for, correctness and incompleteness. And it turned out there was a whole amount of plutonium, bomb material, that had not been included in the declaration. And that's when North Korea was caught out. So it was clearly producing more plutonium than it was willing to declare under its safeguards agreement. And that, of course, led to the whole unraveling of the North Korean case, that they were only engaged in peaceful nuclear activity. So that's a good example of how complex the agency's work can be, because you can't simply accept what a state says they have. You have to think through the logic of their program and try and involve as much information as you can in making a decision about compliance. It's very difficult. On the case of Iran, Iran has used the presentation of new evidence to the IAEA, sometimes from intelligence agencies, some from opposition groups, to claim that the agency has become politicized. I actually don't agree with that. I think the agency should be bringing in as much information as it can about every country, examining it fairly, and then making a decision on the basis of that. Now, that can be fraught with danger because intelligence agencies can plant information with the agency. They might be presenting incomplete information. So there could be a hidden agenda, in other words, by a country doing that. The same applies to an opposition group. They also may have a hidden agenda. But the agency needs to be very clever about this, and I think normally they are. They don't take such information at face value. They do examine it for its merits. But Iran always uses this excuse by saying, well, evidence has been presented once before and was found to be incorrect. This evidence has come from Western spies or Israel. The Iranians are basically trying to use every excuse they can to avoid revealing their past activities. And there's just a pattern of this procrastination over time. And I have great sympathy for the agency because they're extremely sensitive about this. They know they have to get the Iran case exactly right. If you read their reports over time, you'll see they're increasingly meticulous about how they detail the Iran case. But I have no doubt that Iran has been preparing all the elements of a nuclear weapons program, at least up until 2003. They probably stopped most of that activity thereafter. The difficulty is that they won't come clean and confess that. That's a huge problem, and it has soured the agency because the issue infects the governing board and the General Conference. And one suggestion has been made that as in some legal systems, a deal could be made where we say to Iran, okay, if you confess everything you've done, then there'll be no further consequences. Sanctions will be dropped. But I'm not quite sure that we're at that stage yet where such a deal as that could be done.
The question actually does raise an important issue, which is the relative balance of independent capacity to investigate and dependence on intelligence sources of other countries. Is there a general sense of what that balance is normally, or does it hugely vary from case to case? I imagine cases where there's no on-site inspectors, it must all come from intelligence agencies of other countries.
Yes, well, over time, the IAEA has acquired more intelligence information from more countries. Originally, it was probably only the United States, I suspect, in the Iraq case. but the agency has realized the sensitivity of this. So in the latest Iran report, I think they talked about 10 countries providing information, and that's probably true because people would be able to count up exactly who they were. They're probably mostly Western countries. Perhaps Russia is now providing information. Israel, certainly. So it's a very sensitive issue. But the other thing the agency is doing is using open source information. And it is amazing what's available in open sources. Government reports, websites, annual reports by atomic energy agencies. They even look at the absence of scientific articles by certain nuclear scientists to see a pattern over time. Suddenly they drop out of view. They're not publishing in the open literature. Why is that happening? So they're actually being very clever about this and commissioning studies of individual countries, and eventually it'll be every country, I presume, to track open source information on those countries. So they have now what's an all sources approach. So they certainly don't rely just on intelligence information. They use every resource they can in obtaining information. They even purchase overhead satellite imagery themselves. So they investigate satellite imagery too. Am I dropping out? Thanks.
You mentioned that Iran is a case where the agency wants to get it exactly right. I imagine they always want to get it exactly right. So there's two kinds of errors. There's the false positive and the false negative, where in one case you are convinced that a country is pursuing a nuclear program, they're not. I guess that would be Iraq. And another case where you think they're not and they are, I guess that would be Syria. Is one of those two types of errors easier to avoid? Is one of those two types of errors more common? Is the IAEA system designed to deal with one of those two types of errors better than the other?
Well, because they're so careful, there's never been a case where they accused a country and it turned out to be wrong.
Well, other than Iraq.
In fact, rather than...
Iraq.
Iraq, yes. Yeah. But of course, Iraq did have capabilities at one stage, but they were destroyed, including by the IAEA themselves. Iraq is a peculiar case. So they always err on the side of not declaring a non-compliance case. And as a result, they have missed a few relatively minor ones. They missed South Korea, for instance. They missed Egypt. Egypt had been engaged in some activities which it shouldn't have, and these were only revealed much later on. They probably could have been revealed at the time had the agency pressed Egypt more. But the agency is aware always of the huge political consequences of accusing any country of non-compliance. So they err on the side of the benefit of the doubt. But in many cases, well, the cases we've seen where non-compliance has occurred, after a while it just becomes overwhelmingly obvious and the agency can't avoid that. Now, some accuse Mohammed al-Baradei, the previous Director General, of being soft on Iran. My interpretation of that is that, not that he was soft on them, but he feared the political consequences of declaring non-compliance too early and too adamantly. So he held off on it, largely because he was scared the United States would bomb Iran as they'd bombed Iraq. Al-Baradei felt quite responsible for the Iraq war because he wasn't able to convince them that Iraq had given up all its nuclear capabilities. So in the case of Iran, he thought he'd learned those lessons and was very unwilling to accuse Iran of non-compliance.
But that wasn't for lack of trying on his part.
No. I mean, they sent the inspectors in, they tried to get as much of a response from Iran as they possibly could. But in the view of many, he gave them too much of the benefit of the doubt and waited too long to call them on their activities. Right. So you can learn the wrong lessons from these cases and be too sensitive. Mr. Romano, on the other hand, has become tougher on Iran. So he's learned the lesson the opposite direction. He thinks the agency should be more willing to call non-compliance as soon as it sees it, as soon as it has enough evidence.
So we're always trying to fix the most recent mistake.
Yes, exactly.
Question again from our web audience, Brian in Halifax. Japan ignored the IAEA's concerns about safety at Fukushima. How many other countries have done this with regard to safety? If so, what explains this?
Well, the problem is with nuclear safety, we don't know what we don't know. There is a nuclear safety convention, a treaty, as I mentioned, and the parties to that meet periodically. And every country is supposed to present a national report on the state of their nuclear safety. Most do, some don't. Even some countries which want nuclear reactors don't, like Bangladesh, for instance. So there's some countries we really don't have much information on. Every country, as far as I know, has now accepted one peer review by the World Association of Nuclear Operators, but this organisation doesn't reveal its information. So we just hope that this WANO organisation does the right thing and points out the deficiencies in safety, and then countries begin to comply with that. In terms of the agency, they haven't inspected every nuclear power plant for nuclear safety violations, so they're reliant on self-reporting, which is one of the weaknesses of the system. But we just know that there are some reactors which are very unsafe. One of them is in Armenia. Armenia has a very old Soviet reactor in the Chernobyl family of reactors, still operating. Armenia is desperate to have energy, of course. It's been unwilling to shut that down. And Mr. Romano has now been there, and the agency has been pressing Armenia to institute the necessary safety reforms if it won't shut it down, which would be the best thing to actually close this thing. So we know that Armenia has one of the worst, but there could be others, and unfortunately we don't have enough information because inspections aren't compulsory and reporting isn't compulsory.
Another question from the floor. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Mine is two-pronged. One is when we're talking about building new nuclear plants in the developing world, is there consideration being given to fault lines after the Japanese incident? That could happen very easily in the States and California and in other areas of the world. So is that being researched or looked at? The other is nuclear waste. We're talking about the power plants and the safety, but what about the storage of nuclear waste? In Ontario, for instance, we're dumping it into mines, sealing them. The core of the earth is being heated. Is any research or consideration given to what's happening over in the whole picture? And the other thing is the decommissioning of nuclear subs. And my understanding is that they're being sunk in the Bering Sea by Russia and in other areas. Is there any research or compliance in those areas? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a three-part question, so I need to write it down. Just in terms of earthquakes, you're talking about fault lines and nuclear power reactors. Yes, the agency is doing work on this. They have an international seismic safety centre now, relatively recent, funded paradoxically by the Japanese, even before Fukushima, because Japan's subjected to frequent earthquakes. That research centre is studying how to avoid placing nuclear power reactors near fault lines, and Jordan actually listened to its recommendation and moved the planned site of their nuclear reactor. So it's already had one effect. Jordan paid attention and moved. Whether other countries will do so is another question, but after Fukushima, the agency now has a powerful incentive to advise countries accordingly, and hopefully they will follow that. I'm not sure what you do about existing power plants. That is a real concern. You can strengthen them after building them, but that is enormously expensive, of course. On nuclear waste, that is a huge issue. We're generating nuclear material that can last for thousands of years. I'm not sure that Ontario is putting it down empty mine shafts. In fact, Canada has an excellent plan to proceed to deal with this issue. At the moment, all nuclear waste everywhere in the world is stored at nuclear power plant sites, at least in the interim, and sometimes it's moved to central storage facilities, but they are temporary as well. No country in the world has a permanent storage facility for high-level nuclear waste, which is the most dangerous type. Canada's plan is very sensible, which is to study all the options, to discuss with local communities whether they might wish to have such a storage facility. These would be deep geological repositories. They would be a shaft drilled into the earth, and then the waste would be in canisters, sealed canisters, and put into the earth and then sealed and as a permanent repository. So Canada's plan is to deal with this in very slow, careful stages, consulting with communities as it goes. The Americans took the opposite tack, which was to nominate Yucca Mountain in Nevada as their sole site, whether the Nevadans liked it or not. And as we know, that project's in huge trouble. The very sensible Finns are leading the world on this. They have actually started to drill their repository. They've found 2 communities willing to have the waste buried, because essentially it's safe. It's a political issue more than a technical issue. Communities feel uncomfortable with this. But what we're discovering is that communities that already have nuclear facilities and are used to this being nearby are often the first ones to put up their hands and say they'll have them. So the community around Sellafield in the United Kingdom, for instance, have volunteered to have to host the UK's first long-term waste repository. So you can handle it politically, because politics is the biggest issue here, but it has to be done with great sensitivity and consulting the local communities. In Canada, that includes Aboriginal communities as well, and the way it's being handled, I think, here is a model for other countries to follow. The third was nuclear subs. Yes, the Russians were in the practice of sinking their nuclear subs. As far as I know, they've stopped that. Canada, in fact, and other G10 countries have been, or G8 countries have been putting money over the years into helping dismantle former Soviet submarines, to deal with the waste issue, to deal with the old reactors, which has been a very worthwhile program because it's environmental as well as useful in terms of safety and security and non-proliferation. So, but that Soviet nuclear legacy was an enormous problem, and I think we're moving towards solving it, but it's still a difficult issue.
We have one more question from our web audience, from Gillian here in Waterloo. To what extent does the preferences and style of the acting Director General affect the priorities of the agency?
That's a great question, Julian. The Director General has enormous influence on the style of the agency. Luckily, the IAEA has had quite a few very competent, capable Directors General, but they've all had their different styles. The Swedes were very careful, very lawyerly, very, what should I say, very steadfast in their helmsmanship of the agency. They also had to cope with a number of crises, but they did extremely well. One of these was Hans Blix, who you may know then became head of one of the bodies set up to investigate weapons in Iraq. Then we had Mohammed al-Baradei, an Egyptian who was at the agency for, I think, 12 years. He had a style that was more reminiscent of an entrepreneur. He won the Nobel Peace Prize along with the IAEA, as you will recall. And he was very good in promoting the agency internationally on the world stage, which was a good thing. It had been relatively obscure previously. However, he did have a style that angered the Americans over Iraq and Iran, which was unfortunate, and in some minds led to a greater politicization of the agency. So that was an impact that was very noticeable. Mr. Romano is a much more modest Japanese diplomat who is very cautious in the way he operates the agency. In some ways, that's probably useful to bring it back from that highly politicized profile, but again, it's changed the way the agency runs. So the Director General can have enormous influence, including on the way member states act towards the agency, and he can be very active in having states give more funding to the agency, in crafting political compromises where that's possible. So you really look to the DG to be not just the public face, but also the fixer inside the agency who manages to get things done. So it's quite an enormous job, you can imagine, because the agency now has 153 member states, and he has to somehow satisfy the demands of all those members, as well as the expectations of the outside world and the nuclear industry. It's quite a challenge, which is one reason why I think there should be a Deputy Director General to relieve him of some of those responsibilities. So that's a great question.
Do you think we'll see a woman as Director General anytime soon?
We could very well, yeah. It's happened in other UN agencies. So there haven't been any candidates so far. They've always been men, as far as I'm aware. But there's no reason why not.
Very good. Well, we haven't managed to stump you, which is a terrific sign, and I feel enlightened. Thank you very much, Trevor, for sharing your time and expertise with us. A terrific report and a terrific survey for us tonight. So let me invite Fred Kuntz to come on the stage and say a few final words for us.
Yes, thank you. And my first comment is an appreciation of what we've heard here tonight. I think we've all come away this evening with a greater understanding of the IAEA as an organization that is in need of reform, and but ultimately is contributing to a safer world. I don't think the average household in Canada or beyond is probably aware of the IAEA. I think it's a specialized area that you're working in here, a specialized area of knowledge. But given the importance of the nuclear industry to our energy needs, and also the potential risks of weaponization, the safeguard and the security risks, the terror risks, the accidents, we all have a stake in an IAEA that operates well. And so your work is extremely valuable to the entire world and to all of us here. So thank you for your research project, for your report, and for your time with us here tonight. Thank you very much. Now, those of you who were in the CIGI auditorium just before the event, you may have noticed some videos that were playing, a series of interviews on the IAEA and nuclear governance up on our screens here. Those come to us from an online interactive feature that was created to support Trevor's report, and it's available online for anyone who'd like to learn a little bit more about the IAEA and go a little deeper into it. It's at cgonline.org/interactive/IAEA. And I'd also like to mention that the video from tonight's live webcast will be edited and posted to CIGI's website in our online video archive. Finally, I'd like to say thanks to CIGI's event sponsors, 570 News and Wordsworth Books, for another terrific season of public lectures. And I'd especially like to thank CIGI's volunteers. They're wonderful. All the kind people that you meet at the registration desk and at the microphones on the aisles and the ushers. These are people who freely give their time to support CIGI's community events, and we thank them for it. So please visit the CIGI website over the summer for information on the upcoming 2012-2013 Signature Lecture Series we plan to launch again in September with exceptional speakers on important issues in global affairs. Thank you for coming to CIGI, and have a great summer.